As we all know, on February 24th, 2022, the Russian forces entered Ukraine. The initial Russian progress in the first 48 hours was quite quick. At certain points of the front, Russian forces managed to progress 50 miles or more. That was likely due to both Ukraine's leadership not really believing Russia would indeed attack, so they were unprepared, and to the fact it wasn't wise for Ukraine to have lots of units right next to the border, where they would be exposed. But then the pace quickly slowed down. By the fifth day of the war, those Russian thrust vectors added perhaps a dozen or 2 miles. Other areas, such as territory around Kharkiv or Sumy, saw additional over-the-border pushes, which somewhat consolidated the Russian lines. As another week passed, additional progress was equally slow, though there were exceptions, like Russia reaching Mariupol from the west while crossing 160 miles, or reaching over 140 miles towards Kiev from the northeastern border with Russia. The terrain was especially favorable to the Russian armor in the south, as was the taken railroad infrastructure for unit supply. But during the last week or so, there were hardly any Russian pushes to gain additional territory, though certain pockets of Ukraine's army resistance have gotten smaller and smaller. Indeed, in the coming weeks, there's a chance that these pockets might close and that Russia might occupy those lands. If that happens, and if such a pocket is closed, its defenses may crumble very quickly. During the first month of the war, Russian forces have more or less taken control of chunks of Ukrainian territory whose combined area represents between 15 and 25% of Ukraine. That's not counting Crimea or territories within Donetsk and Luhansk regions stemming from 2014. Now, it's important to note that control of territory is a rather fluid term. Not only because the actual frontline can change, for example, at a few points Ukrainian forces have managed to perform small-scale counteroffensives, but also because control of territory is not really a binary matter. Oftentimes Russian forces sent fairly small advanced recon forces. Those could not really control a territory on their own, or a larger force would travel quickly down a road into Ukraine. But such very narrow incursion lines are unstable and can't really be shown on the map. So from the Russian military perspective, was the progress shown so far successful? Well, it depends. Here are 2 examples for context. In 1941, Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union. It was a surprise attack, Soviets weren't mobilized, and the front line was actually a bit shorter than what Russia is taking on today in Ukraine. In the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, back in 1941, the southern part of the Soviet border did not really see any offensives. German advance was initially extremely quick. At some parts of the front, Germans went over 200 miles into Soviet territory within a week. That push slowed down marginally over the next week or 2, while the overall front line stretched towards the south as well. By the 4th week, the push towards Moscow stalled and took a breather, and Germany focused more on pushing farther in the south and in the north. Of course, as we all know, despite this much quicker initial advance, Germany lost in the end. So territory taken doesn't have to mean much. Also, the Germans did it with a much larger force. Given how fairly small the Russian force is compared to the huge front line, what advance the Russian forces actually achieved so far was fairly predictable. But could it have been much quicker? There's another historical example: US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Unlike Soviet Union in 1941 and Ukraine today, Iraq's territory was completely different. Huge swaths of empty flat desert in the west, no obstacles for the enemy to hide behind, no civilian population to get in the way. US progress was lightning fast in some areas, using very narrow corridors over those empty lands. But by the first week, actual consolidated control over Iraqi territory was confined to very small patches of land in the south. By the end of the second week of that war, coalition forces went further towards Baghdad via narrow corridors, and the consolidated control over Iraqi territory was still fairly small, reaching some 100 miles into southern Iraq. The thing is, the Iraqi war was one where circumstances allowed the US to go into such deep incursions, without fear of getting counterattacked and possibly having those advance forces cut off. Not only was the area flat, but the US enjoyed total control of the air. Furthermore, it had the equipment to exploit that control of the air. It had various aerial surveillance gear that could monitor large enemy formations from quite far away. Again, flat desert lands helped in that regard, as they were a high-contrast background for the sensors. But perhaps most crucially, Iraqi defenses in 2003 fell apart on their own. The morale was already low after the Gulf War of 1991, and by 2003 the Iraqi army was happier to surrender than to fight and die for Saddam. While in theory Baghdad could have been a nightmare of urban warfare, in practice the Iraqis simply did not want to put up a fight. The whole war was over in less than a month and a half. Let's contrast that to Operation Barbarossa. The Soviets were surprised and started to mobilize late, but they had the will to fight, and they had a lot of territory to trade with the enemy. So eventually German advances lost steam, and the tide of war changed. Which of those two examples is closer to what we're seeing now in Ukraine? Ukraine did not mobilize for war beforehand. Total mobilization came almost a day after Russia attacked. Partial small-scale mobilization order came just a day before the attack. Yet it does not seem as if Ukrainians lack the will to fight. In that regard, they're like the Soviet example rather than the Iraqi one. But let's backtrack to something we said earlier. The front that Russia is trying to control is so vast it eclipses even the one in Operation Barbarossa, lengthwise. And Russia is trying to do all that with a fairly small force. At the beginning of the war, US intelligence estimated Russia had some 170,000 troops placed near Ukraine's border. Some other estimates went up to 190,000 troops. Even more surprisingly, by the second day of the war, Russia did not move in all its forces, but kept roughly 50% of the forces outside Ukraine on standby. Those are really very small numbers for an offensive of this scale. Based on the overly ambitious attack plans rivaling Operation Barbarossa, based on the fairly small initial forces, with half of the forces waiting to see what the opposition would really be like, it's very apparent the whole Russian plan was not to become stuck in a war of attrition. Russian leadership clearly believed resistance in Ukraine would be much lower. Basically, they believed Ukraine would do what the Iraqis did in 2003 and roll over after a few weeks, that the West would not be sending such vast military help to Ukraine, that perhaps even most of the Ukrainian army would sit still, and that Russia would have to deal with only a few tens of thousands of hardcore nationalists. Basically, that Ukrainian people would not really care who entered the country and who changed their government by military force. So Russia planned accordingly for those unrealistic assumptions. Maybe intelligence reports were deeply flawed, or the leadership relied on unrealistic gut feelings instead of murky intelligence. They didn't plan for a big air campaign, or lots of replacement units, or even for enough logistics to supply weeks of large-scale offensives. For waging a war against a fully adversarial nation the size of Ukraine, with good morale, starting Russian forces were woefully inadequate. Now that Russia does know just what it got itself into, there are attempts to address those issues, but it will take time for enough logistic support to be brought in. It will take time for more and more airstrikes to be organized. Those we already saw happening, as Russian Air Force activity has been rising steadily in the last few weeks. On the other hand, time is not something Russia has due to morale issues. The sheer ambitiousness of Russian initial goals to go after Kiev, after Odessa, probably even going after Transnistria, all the while also taking the entire eastern half of the country, is also such that no military commander would have planned that unless flawed intelligence produced orders saying the opposition would not be the whole Ukraine but only select small enemy groups. So now the Russian goals might have to be reassessed, given the realities on the front. Trying to double down on initial plans and ignore the realities on the battlefield may lead the Russian military into even more problems than they are in right now. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.